this Sunday on your GPBC.
Formula One on GPBC 1.
The battle for the Formula One championship heads to Brazil.
Edwards, Hamilton, Ruby, Ungaiat, Andretti, Rosberg.
Jade Ruby ruled in Texas, but Carl Edwards stole the show in Mexico. And now the battle goes white hot as it heads down south to the land of Samba.
And after Formula One on GPBC 1, the PFA.
Sunday night's big one-on-one, the red-hot Oklahoma City Drillers at 7-1, taking on the unbeaten Super Bowl champion Wichita Warriors. You won't want to miss it. Sunday on GPBC,
your network of the 2018 Winter Olympics.
This is GPBC News Radio Omaha. At 11:55, downtown temperature in the nation's capital, 49 degrees Fahrenheit, 9 degrees Celsius. I'm Alexandra Keaton. This is the news at this moment. We have breaking news that has come into us. Sources within the California military have told Carson Television News that 2 hours ago, 2 Confederate strategic-class bombers overflew southern Alaska, flanked by Confederate fighters. The Confederate Defense Directorate said that the flyover was, quote, a scheduled exercise, but also a show of solidarity with the godly Juneau government against the godless interference led by the Republic of Greater California. California's Secretary of State Kamala Harris said in a written statement just moments ago that, quote, this is another example of Confederate provocation, and I would remind the Atlanta government of the official position of the Republic of Greater California in regard to such matters. It has not been determined whether the aircraft, both T-160 supersonic intercontinental bombers, were carrying nuclear payloads. Sources close to Rocky Mountain's Conservative Party leader Ted Cruz say that they have, quote, an agreement in principle with the Rockies Alternative and the RMR Galtus Party towards a coalition to form a new government in that country. Sources told Rocky Mountain Television this morning that all sides are prepared to enter a coalition and form a government pending what was termed, quote, understandings on some of the finer points. The question will now turn to who will be the next prime minister of the Rocky Mountain Republic. There are concerns that some of the coalition may not agree with Cruz or with former Prime Minister Richard Lamb, who leads the Galtus Party in the country. The leader of the Rockies Alternative, Colin Simpson, himself the son of a former prime minister, has been non-committal on his future plans. Last night, elections took place in the eastern states of the IRNA, and there were regional and municipal votes in New England. There was a major upset in industrial American New Jersey as two-term Governor Chris Christie, touted by some as a leading candidate for president in 2020, was beaten by State Senate Majority Leader Cory Booker. Booker is the state's first African industrial governor. In New England, regional elections were a sweep for the Liberal Democratic Party, as the LDP won control of the parliaments of the 3 regional areas of the country. Analysts say this result could play an important part in the shape of national politics in the year ahead and could raise the possibility of a general election next year. The LDP is one of 4 partners in a grand national coalition led by conservative Prime Minister Lincoln Chafee. Alaska's President Todd Palin is in the People's Republic of China today, meeting with Chinese President Bo Xilai, who warned Japan this morning against, quote, non-interference in the affairs of brother countries of the Orlando Pact. Xilai condemned Japan's deployment of a carrier battle group along the Alaskan coast near the Aleutian Islands. Speaking of Japan, some breaking news from there. Elections held on Wednesday. NHK projects that the next Democratic Alliance and Prime Minister Aguri Suzuki have been reelected, holding 255 seats in the next diet. In North America, voters go to the polls in Quebec, and they're expected to close at approximately 8 p.m. Plains time. The election is expected to be very close between the ruling Liberal Labour Party, led by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and the Social Unity Party, led by Michel Jean. The Bureau of Atomic Scientists announced this morning that they will reset the nuclear doomsday clock to 2 minutes to midnight. It is the 3rd time that the clock has been reset this year. It began the year at 5 minutes, was reset to 3 minutes in July, and now has been dropped to 2 minutes. In their statement, the Bureau said the reset was, quote, warranted by the current situations in Europe, Alaska, the South China Sea, and in Central America, all involving widespread deployment of potential nuclear aggression. This should be alarming to the entire world and must be a focus of the next round of Cairns Convention talks. Turning to business news, indexes across the board are down in mixed trading right now. The Dow Jones is slightly off yesterday's volume. The Havana, Dallas, and Minneapolis indexes are also down. The London, Paris, Munich, and Stockholm exchanges closed down slightly. Nikkei and Hong Kong held steady in mixed trading. In entertainment news, New York Congressman Chris Collins and Jim O'Rourke, co-sponsors of a bill to put government restraints on television programs, drew the ire of one of the stars they cited in their recent interviews on the bill. Australian actress Alicia Debnam Carey, who plays Lexa on the sci-fi hit Earth Tribe, told New England's Television 2 this morning that she is appalled that Collins and O'Rourke are painting her with what she called the scarlet letter of piety. Debnam Carey's character on the show is slated to be married this season to co-star Eliza Taylor's character, which both congressmen cited as an example of moral decay run amok on our airwaves, as O'Rourke said to the Trump News Channel 2 days ago. Debnam Carey responded in this manner. The way that they've characterized myself and Eliza, it's bloody appalling, and it's bloody unfair. Looking at the records of these two men, it's not surprising the stances they take. But to try and slander the name of me or any artist is cruel, vile, and an insult to the intelligence of the viewing public who can think for themselves. Earth Tribe, now in its 4th season, has grown to be a top 10 show in most of North America. A quick look at the world of sports. Pyongyang is planning a massive party Thursday to celebrate a World Series win. The victorious Pilots, who clinched the World Series championship Monday night with a 9-5 victory over the Boston Red Sox, landed earlier today at Kim Sung-il International Airport to an estimated 60,000 fans waiting for their heroes. It's estimated that 1 million fans will line the streets of downtown Pyongyang for a grand parade. The biggest applause was reserved for George Springer, the World Series MVP, who set a World Series championship record with 9 home runs, including 3 in the decisive Game 7. The ironic part of this story? Springer grew up in the Connecticut region of New England and was a die-hard Red Sox fan. Coming up next on GPBC News Radio Omaha, The Lunch Crunch with Kareem Balian. It's noon. Hello, Omaha. It's lunchtime. I'm Kareem Balian, and this is the GPBC News Lunch Crunch. There's just too much going on in the world right now. Alaska, Maine, elections, Central America. It's hard to make sense of it all. But we have a friend on the show who can help us out. If there's anybody who can make sense of what's going on in North America and the world right now, it's Professor E.D. Rochelle of Omaha University. And he's in our studio joining us for the Lunch Crunch. Doc Rochelle, how you doing?
Corinne, it's always good to be down with the Lunch Crunch. It's always great to be here, and it's good to be a part. And you're right, there is a lot going on. And there's a lot to crunch through, but we'll try and make some sense of it.
Doc, welcome to the show. But before we get into all that about what's going on in the world, how are you doing?
Well, I'll tell you, I've got a lot going on. Not teaching as much this semester. I'm finishing a book, and I'm taking care of the administrative functions. I'm the interim dean of the history department right now while they're conducting their search to find us a new dean. So mostly, I'm just writing a book, raising kids, and enjoying life, even with what's going on right now, including what happened in Alaska a few hours ago.
Well, let's just dive right in. What's your take on Alaska? I mean, you've already had rockets fired both ways, and there's the situation in Central America, and there's the South China Sea, and there's the Philippines, and Maine, Portugal, Central Europe, which still hasn't gone away. How scared should we be, Doc?
Corinne, I'm plenty scared, and I'm not just speaking as a professor. I'm speaking as somebody who wore the uniform of my country and has been shot at. There's a lot to be scared of. And there are 2 news items I think people should pay attention to. Obviously, what happened in Alaska this afternoon, I'm still wondering what were the Confederates thinking with this so-called show of solidarity. But also the Bureau of Atomic Scientists moving the clock back to 2 minutes to midnight. That's very sobering, because the Bureau, they just don't set that clock on a whim. They take a careful note of what's going on in the world. And if they're saying it's 2 minutes, I'm inclined to believe them. We haven't been 2 minutes to midnight. We haven't been that close to the brink since the trade war. And in the trade war, nuclear weapons were actually used. I hope that all sides show some restraint. And we need some restraint right now, Corinne. We need restraint more than anything else. In early December, the Carnes Convention meetings will happen. And the Confederates are talking about signing the Carnes Conventions, which I think is a good thing for everyone. That the CSA signs on the dotted line and gets with the rest of the world and starts marching towards real reductions in strategic nuclear weapons. But this is not a good sign. This, added to what you're seeing in the Pacific, in the South China Sea, and in the Philippines, and what you've seen in Europe. My brother-in-law was directly affected in that. This is very sobering. And I think leaders need to take notice of that.
With that in mind, what's your thoughts on what M.U. Franken said a few days ago, that the GPUR needs to upgrade its military response in Oklahoma, needs to put more troops down in the Freedom Frontier and in the Boot Heel? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, Corinne, first off, it's Al Franken. And I always take M.U. Franken with a grain of salt, even if he's in the party which I tend to support, the least lobby. Honestly, though, on this one, I think, to quote Cameo, he's talking out the side of his neck. I really think Al Franken needs to kind of slow his roll, as my goddaughter Veronica would say. As a matter of fact, what I really believe needs to happen along our borders and the borders with the CSA, I would like to see the UN designate that a demilitarized zone, a 10-mile buffer each way along the border from the Crimson Wall all the way to the Boot Heel. That's something, in my mind, should have been done back in 1960. It's too militarized there now. I mean, look at what happened on Columbus Day. Corinne, we had the most losses in Columbus Day ever. When the UN General Secretary has to call both ambassadors into the office. And it's something that's been done in the past, but this went beyond the pale. For the first time, people are getting the first-hand accounts. And again, this is why the Greg Palast organization is really that important, because they're going to give you the story that the rest of the news media isn't going to give you.
And I take it you've heard the rumors now that the Greg Palast organization could be a part of a 24-hour news channel with QJMJ in Motown.
Oh, Corinne, I hope not. I hope not. I've heard some inklings of that, but I really sincerely hope that they don't do it. I hope that the GPO stays independent, because we need independent news sources. And you know I'm a contributor to GPBC News, and I'm not saying anything bad about my own employer, but those independent gadflies like the Palace and the Lennon Letter, they keep the rest of us honest, and it's a good thing. I would prefer that they stay independent. But back to what we're seeing here in Alaska, I'd like to know exactly what Newt Gingrich and his military command was thinking with this quote-unquote show of solidarity. That's not a show of solidarity. That was a show of force. And it was a show of force that's completely unwarranted. You already have enough violence going on in Alaska as it is. There needs to be negotiation. And that's what it comes down to.
Now, you're talking about, wait a minute, there's been negotiation, though, Doc. There has been negotiation. Are you saying that the free world should back down?
I'm absolutely not saying the free world should back down, Corinne. No. I'm saying that everybody needs to sit down. You're firing rockets at each other. Well, first, let's start from the beginning.
Well, I can see already the phones are starting to line up, and they're lighting up right now. I mean, that's one thing about you, Doc. You get the phones lighting up.
Well, Corinne, I'm happy to oblige, but seriously, and I know I've gotten a lot of people who sent me emails and so on saying that I'm out to lunch. Rush Limbaugh said, I'm in my ivory tower again, but that's Rush being Rush. Love you, Rush. Just kidding. No, not really. But what's happening in Alaska is just another sign that elections have consequences. Political decisions have consequences. I don't support the Palin government at all. I support the right of indigenous peoples to uphold their own self-determination, which they did with the Point Barrow government by breaking away. And I like the fact that the Plainsian government is supporting the Point Barrow government. I agree with President Wellstone that we have to give humanitarian and limited military support. But but you have some people like Al Franken talking about let's put boots on the ground. And I say, no, we don't need boots on the ground here. We need diplomats on the ground. We need to make that an amicable divorce. Everyone goes on with life. Because if this goes too far, we have too many hot spots and we've been ducking the Reaper too many times.
I have a caller on the line right here, Doc, who says he kind of wants to, quote, chastise you. Caller, you want to chastise Dr. Rochelle? Here's your chance.
I absolutely do want to chastise you. Professor, I've heard you on one end talk about how we have to stand up for the plains. On the other hand, you're turned into this namby-pamby peace dove. I heard about what happened in California, and I think we need to knock those bombers down. I think that we've got to be in the fight because all across North America right now, there's a lot of people who just don't get it, that there's only one thing the Confederates respect, and that's force. And I look at what's going on in Maine. You got people wringing their hands. No one should be wringing their hands to the Confederates. We need to fight them. And Doc, I know you went to war. You ought to be ashamed of yourselves.
Now, sir, wait. Now, sir, hold on. Hold on 1 minute. Sir, don't you want peace? Isn't that what anyone wants? And yes, I did go to war. Lost two of my best friends on the Bettendorf-Davenport front in 91.
That's all the more reason why you need to be standing up.
My brother-in-law
that's all the more reason why you need to stand up.
Really going through it with the PTSD, just as I am. He was caught in a rocket attack for Christmas last year.
You think you're the only one who had PTSD?
So believe me, you dang right I want some peace. No, sir, I am not finished. I won, sir. Sir, I need to quote a little Gordon Sumner here right now. Across free North America, there's a growing feeling of hysteria, conditioned to respond to all the threats of rhetorical speeches by Confederates.
What kind of communist stuff
what those bombers were was in many ways a rhetorical speech. That's what it was. It's a provocation.
And shouldn't that be responded to?
Not in the way you want to do it, sir.
Sir, thank you for your call, but, Doc, there's a lot of fear out there, and that caller has a little bit of a point. I mean, I think what happened in Alaska is a little bit more than a provocation, and really you look at Maine, and you look at Alaska, and you look at Portugal, and you look at Central Europe. The Orlando Pact has grown. 3 years ago, this really didn't exist. It wasn't even a thing, and now it's a serious thing.
Well, yes and no. Corinne, let's understand one thing about the Orlando Pact. Yes, the Orlando Pact has grown. Yes, it seems that they've made all this headway, but here's the real about the Orlando Pact. The Orlando Pact, all the nations of the Orlando Pact have tenuous situations within their countries. Yes, the CSA has a large army, a large navy, a large air force. They are a formidable military power. Yet, as we speak, they have to occupy two of their own states because of internal strife, because of internal insurgents, because of protest groups, anti-government groups, and it's like that across the entire Orlando Pact. The whole Orlando Pact is going through the same thing. Once again, they recently got hit by 2 storms, and they have more people displaced, and they haven't cleaned up the last 2 hurricanes or that dirty bomb attack that they orchestrated on their own soil in South Carolina. They still have a lot of things to fix, Corinne. Even with all that's going on, we as Plainsians, we as free North Americans should not cower. We shouldn't be shaking in our boots. The strength lies in the free world still. Even with all the things that's going on, even with some of the government difficulties we're seeing, the results that we had in the IRNA and in New England, I don't think that we should be unduly scared, but we should be concerned.
Now, Doc, but you did say you are a little bit scared. You're scared about what happened in Alaska, I'm sure.
Well, of course. We're talking about 2 supersonic bombers possibly carrying nuclear weapons on the deck in a quote unquote show of force. But overall, I'm still confident as a Plainsian, I'm still confident as a free North American that we're on the right side. And I believe we just need to stand firm as free North Americans. The Confederates haven't beaten us before. They're not going to beat us now. To quote Martin Luther King, the arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And I will say this right now in confidence, we're at the end game now. In
The end
terms of the
game,
Confederate
huh?
States.
You're the end game in what way, Doc? I mean, what kind of end game are you talking about? Are you saying perhaps the Confederate States is actually at a point before its fall?
It's going to fall, Corinne. It's only a matter of time. And that fall, and in some ways, the Confederate States have already fallen. I mean, look at what's going to happen there on Saturday. They're going to have an election for a national colored representative assembly. They're going to give African Confederates control over some of their affairs. Now, I know that for the most part, this began as this new covenant began as somewhat bogus, but the street heat that's been applied by anti-government groups, by the SCLC, by so many blacks who have stood up and said no, and a growing number of whites that are doing the same thing, the Atlanta government's had to make some good.
We got another caller coming in right now on this. Caller, you're on the air.
Thank you, Corinne. Dr. Rochelle, really? You really think just because they're letting them play a little football that they're really going to, that the Confederates really want peace? Look, my boyfriend is down along the Crimson Wall, and you mean to tell me that my boyfriend needs to back up off the wall? What about them backing up off the wall?
Well, ma'am, I'm not talking about us going way back. I'm talking about a 10-mile buffer zone on each side, a DMZ administered by the United Nations. Ma'am, we already have United Nations peacekeeping forces on both sides of the wall. They have to have them. We have to have them. It's part of the 1960 armistice agreement. And I'm hopeful that that armistice agreement becomes a more formal peace treaty when we get to Carnes. That's what their foreign affairs executive was saying. And if there's one person who I know won't truck for any foolishness, it's Foreign Affairs Secretary Goodyear. Tom Goodyear won't truck with any foolishness coming from Spurrier. You can bet the ranch on that. But back to what I'm saying to you, ma'am. I want to keep your boyfriend safe. That is the first goal. Ma'am, let me finish. This is important here because I served too. So I know what your boyfriend's going through. Ma'am, I don't want your boyfriend to spend one more day on the Crimson Wall than he has to. Because if we fight a war with the Confederate States, if we have to fight the Mid-North American War again, I'm going to tell you right now, your boyfriend is not only going to have to deal with the Confederate forces, your boyfriend will have to see mushroom clouds, because you can bet there will be nuclear weapons used if we fight another war with the Confederate States. And that's not something I want to see happen. Now, that doesn't mean I'm for peace at any price. And I want to tell anyone who's a prospective caller, hear me out.
Well, what's to hear you about? What you're saying is that we have to back down because of them and the possibility of nuclear war, yada, yada, yada.
I'm not saying we have to back down by ourselves, ma'am. We all need to back down. Again, a demilitarized zone. A few weeks ago, the ambassadors to the UN from the GPR and the CSA got called into Mary Robinson's office, and Mary Robinson, the General Secretary of the UN, was very, let's just say she wasn't kind to either side. Too much blood's getting spilled on those borders. The Confederates have strategic nuclear forces on the borders. We're putting them there. To me, that's going a little bit too far on both sides. Right now, we have tactical nuclear forces of the Confederates, and those need to be dismantled. I'm in total agreement with that. The Confederates are pushing too far, and we're up in the ante, they're upping the ante. What I'm saying is everybody needs to calm down. That's what I'm saying.
Switching some gears, and let's talk about what's going on in the Rocky Mountain Republic. The conservatives say that they have a deal, Doc. They said that this morning they have at least an agreement in principle. It looks like it could be a Rockies alternative, conservative, perhaps even the Galtists getting involved. What's your take on it, Doc?
Corinne, what it means is get your popcorn out. It's going to be a wild show because I'll say this. The RMR situation has played into Richard Lamb's hands.
It played into Richard's hands? How so?
Oh, yeah. It played into his hands beautifully, Corinne. Because you just look at it like this. Right now, the Rockies plus the Conservatives are at 66 seats. It takes 83 to form a government. Now, the Galtists are sitting with 21 seats, which means whatever type of coalition you want to build, knowing that the top four parties don't, maybe two can work with each other and they can't work with the other two, Richard Lamb holds the balance of what can build a government. He holds the balance. Now, in the last election, the Mountain Socialists and the Liberal Independents got together and they bypassed both the Conservatives and the Galtists. They bypassed everyone. They were able to have enough votes to put together to build a consortium by themselves. Now they don't have that. And Richard Lamb knows they don't have that. So what Richard's doing is he's going to sit and bide his time and he's going to listen to all the offers, knowing that if you bring Richard Lamb and the Galtist in, you got to give them something to get anything you want. And Richard knows that. The question is, who's willing to dance with Prime Minister Doom and Gloom?
It's a rather demanding dance, wouldn't you say?
Corinne, it's like dancing with someone with three left feet, because if there's one thing I know about, and we all know about Richard Lamb, is two things. One, whatever is in his head, it's going to come out of his mouth. And number two, when he believes he's right, he's almost impossible to deal with. Remember the number of times that the Plains governments had to fight the Rocky Mountains over water because Richard Lamb believes he is right and only he is right. Well, that's going to become squared or cubed if you're bringing him into a government. And he holds 21 seats, and those 21 seats, for the most part, are going to stick together.
So, what are the prospects then for a government? I mean, who do you see coming out of that?
You'll have to ask Colin Simpson that, because he's the other part of this equation. Colin Simpson's father, Alan, is well-loved, still is well-loved in the Rocky Mountain Republic. Many say he was taken out of office too soon. He had to resign after 2 years because of ill health. But in those 2 years, he was able to be very effective as a prime minister. Got a lot done, including a new water compact with the GPUR, which in many ways has been a template for water rights across the nations west of the Mississippi. The thing about Alan Simpson is he found ways to build consensus. Now, if Colin wants to build consensus, I think, in my mind, I think the Rockies, I don't see an alliance with the Conservatives happening. I think
No
something at
alliance
the
with them?
11 hour is going to bring that through. And if it does, I think that they're going to look at the Mountain Socialists and the Liberal Independents. I mean, say what you want, as clunky and tenuous as that was, it did last the full 5 years.
There's been reports that Seal probably doesn't want to go another term or even part of another term. If so, who do you think will be the next prime minister of the RMR if this deal that they've reported falls through?
I think you're going to have John Hickenlooper. I think the LIP leader, good consensus person from all indications. He was premier of Colorado and was well liked, the mayor of Denver, and he was well regarded. And I think I think things are kind of swinging back to the LIP. I also think that they can bring some more people into the tent, such as getting Ben Nighthorse Campbell. He was with the LIP. He left the party 5 years ago. He's a former prime minister, and now he's leading a group called the First Peoples Movement, which is an indigenous party. They won 3 seats. I think between the Free People's Movement and the Greens, you could bring them in as junior partners into a coalition. And I also think John could be the best person to work with Richard Lamb, because that's what everything's going to come down to. Can you work with Richard Lamb? I can't see Lamb and Cruz working together on a lot of things. Lamb and the Galtists believe pretty much in the idea that, hey, government should stay out of people's lives. Cruz is talking about things like those guys out in the Industrial Republic are talking about in terms of trying to regulate what everybody gets to watch on TV.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Dr. Rochelle, because I really want to discuss that with you, because that really boggles my mind that there are people in 2017 that still want to fight that battle. I mean, they're talking about banning Clexa. I mean, first off, do you know who Clexa is?
Doesn't everybody know who Clexa is? Come on, I watch her. I'm a big sci-fi geek. I love Earth Tribe. I think it's a great show, and it boggles my mind too, Corinne, but it's just interesting that people are trying to fight that fight. Chris Collins and James O'Rourke, I heard what they had to say not too long ago, and I like the fact that Lexa clapped back on them.
I like
Lexa,
that she
girl,
clapped
I
back,
feel
too.
You clapped back. I like the fact that she clapped back. I like the fact she went on the show with what's her name,
Rachel
Maddow out in New England,
Yeah.
and she clapped back, and I like that because I think, I mean, and it's not just here; it's even in the plains. A person who I know and respect, Lornell McPherson, MU, with the PAP. And some of his people are talking about the same thing. They're railing about morality on TV and so on.
Now, I understand that that's also been a big part of this situation with this broadcasting strike in Maine. They've really been on Paul Lepage's radar for quite some time. Talk about that, but also in a larger sense, what is this whole situation in Maine? How has that affected North America in your view?
I'm going to take the back part of that question first, Corinne. First, Maine in many ways has affected the nations east of the Mississippi a great deal, because now many of those nations, and you're looking at like the Atlantic Maritimes and New England, not so much New England, but Vermont, New Hampshire, Quebec, Ontario, those nations are now frontline nations. Basically, they're starting to understand the way we Plainsians have had to live for about 60 plus years. They realize that now there's Johnny Reb is at their doorstep, and Johnny Reb is serious. They now have a full carrier battle group north of Boston. That's a very destabilizing thing for North America. That's a very dangerous thing for North America.
It certainly put a crimp in what's going on in Quebec, wouldn't you say? I mean, that's really defined their whole election.
Just like it did in Ontario, Corinne. I mean, why do you have a Prime Minister, Dan Aykroyd? Because of Maine. Maine changed the whole tenor of that race, and I have a feeling Maine may change a lot of the tenor in what's going on in Quebec. And I want to touch on Quebec real quick because Quebec is not a lot of people think it's a two-person race, and it is, but really, just like a third party could decide, a different party could decide the RMR, the Oka party, a concertation of indigenous political organizations, could scrounge up enough seats to make either Michel Jean or Justin Trudeau prime minister. They could end up being the kingmaker, and they are people that are quite hawkish, and they should be. I mean, I look at you. I've seen some of the underground reporting, and again, Greg Palast organization about what's going on with indigenous populations in Maine, what's going on as far as black populations in Maine. And what's going on with a lot of people just don't agree. You've got the refugee crisis, the refugee situation turned the Ontario election. Jack Layton wanted to hold the line of refugees. Dan Aykroyd, I remember what he said. He cited the Negro Asylum Act and said, we need a Maine Asylum Act in Ontario. We need to do what Plaingens did. And that turned enough votes to put the Ontario Liberals in. And the same thing could happen here. You have Justin Trudeau kind of ambivalent about support, and you have Michel Jean, who's been more strident, but at the same time is dealing with forces in their party that have been more ambivalent. So, and you've got this Oka party, which has gained a lot of momentum because they're standing up. I mean, have you heard of Corinne? Have you heard of the Killer Clown posters?
Actually, I saw one of those online. You know that I'm a fan of Stephen King, so yeah, I read it. You know, they use Pennywise as a symbol of the resistance in Maine. I've seen a couple of those things online.
Yes, and I mean, me being a fan of Stephen King, I've seen a lot of that going around. But those flyers are up all over Montreal. Those flyers have been reported all over Quebec City. More and more people are in, and you're starting to see that even here. You're starting to see like the 18 committees at some of the colleges are also doing things about Maine. I have a couple kids in some classes of mine who are refugees from Maine. They fled Maine before the start of the school year, and some of the things they've told me, you want to do a show, you should get them on sometime. I'll talk to them for you. And the biggest thing is the effect Maine has really had on North America, at least northeastern North America, is that now a lot of those smaller nations are realizing kind of what the GPRs had to deal with. Because, you know, Corinne, many people in the East, when I go back east, in places other than the Industrial Republic, see the Plaingens is like, okay, they're those flyover country dirt farmer people who like war. And I remember at a symposium a year ago in UNCE, I was meeting some academics from Quebec and Vermont who said, do you Plaingens like war? And I said, no. It's just that we've known so much war that we know that the best way to preserve the peace is to prepare for it. And that's a tough thing. But I think now they're seeing that.
One thing I've heard that there is now an internal that Maine. Do you think Maine is at a state of civil war?
Maine, in many ways, has been a state of civil war since their last election, and it was a war in many ways started and fanned by their president, Paul Lepage. He has fanned this war. He ran the campaign that Fred Phelps would have loved to have run in this country.
Really?
That's the best way I can put it.
Fred Phelps. That's a name you haven't heard much of, but Paul Lepage, Fred Phelps. That's an interesting comparison there.
And it's a very appropriate one, and it checks out because you look at what the main first party ran. They ran on economic resentment. In many ways, they ran on racial resentment, and a lot of the attacks are racial in nature. Look who their ally is. The apartheid regime is their ally. That's all you need to know. The riots are getting worse, and then now you've got this situation. There are people standing up, and that's why I say again that people take a good look at what the Confederate apartheid regime has been. And what you're going to find out is, in many ways, the Orlando Pack is going through a lot of pains. Now, I do want to touch on this whole thing about Clexa, because I think that plays very much into Maine.
First off, why do you think Paul Lepage why do you think the Maine government is even caring about Clexa? Do they even play the show there?
Well, not so much there, but the fact that people are finding a way for the show to get there. As it's been reported, the Confederates today filed a complaint with the United Nations because they're accusing Australia of woefully planting little digital thumb drives with episodes of the show on it, and most likely I'm pretty sure the episodes where that first kiss episode between Lexa and Clark, which was kind of endearing, I have to admit.
Oh, wasn't it? I mean, aren't those two just so cute together? Really, they're just cute.
I gotta admit, it's a good couple, and also it's a well written show. I think some people get so caught up in really what was 10 seconds of screen time and this whole romance thing that they forget this is a really well-written show. I mean, I think this is one of the better sci-fi shows I've seen, especially in the last 10 years. To me, it's not quite the Doctor's W, but it's right up there with Longhorn 1. That's how good this show is to me. But I think a lot of this, with the Confederate States putting up that really great complaint, and I loved what a representative for the Foreign Ministry of Australia said. They said an exact quote, "Get a life," which I agree with, to not only to the Confederates but a lot of these people. That's an example of how tenuous the grip is, because they're trying to impose an order that a lot of people just aren't going with. I mean, and in a larger sense, talking about O'Rourke and Collins, and especially O'Rourke, who claims to be of the Progressive Christian Alliance.
I heard about that too.
I don't see how he's progressive at all.
I can't see it, and I've heard that they're Progressive Christian Alliance. They have a group of legislators and concerned people across North America, and they say they're a progressive group. I want to digress there because I want to deal with them. Are they really progressive? What's their deal in your mind?
I want to touch that, but first, just one last thing about Maine. The broadcast strike, in many ways, is exactly an example of what we're seeing with these progressive people, and it all ties in. The reason why you have the broadcast strike, Corinne, is that a lot of technicians, a lot of people work with Maine Public Broadcasting, which is the main public broadcast network in the country. Well, these employees said they didn't want to be a part of Dixie Vision, and that was the edict that came down from their government, that they would become a part of Dixie Vision on December 1st, and these people weren't having it, and that's something that the Orlando Pact often does. The Confederates come in and often set up the new communications infrastructure, Dixie Vision, their big propaganda, whatever channel, and they just said no. And they don't want the censorship that you have in the Confederate States. They weren't having it. These are people that were used to being free broadcasters, having freedom of speech. And to me, that isn't something that I think that Representatives Collin, Representative O'Rourke don't understand, is that ultimately we are at a point where the people are the best arbiter of what they can put in their heads, what they can put in their bodies, what they can watch, what they can read. And Corinne, I am more apt to trust the individual person, the individual consumer over government in regards to what they can see, what they can hear, and what they can read. I think the people can do a better job of that. But even more so when I look, especially Representative O'Rourke. Now, Representative O'Rourke and his Progressive Christian Alliance, I look at the roster of their legislators, and they have more often than not voted for measures that crimp the ability of free nations to help the Southern Christian Liberty Conference, for example. In fact, Representative O'Rourke last year voted for the Netanyahu bill that would have named the Southern Christian Liberty Conference a terrorist group by the Industrial Republic. Thankfully, that was stricken down. But when I look at these people, they may not necessarily support Atlanta, but they act in a fashion like Atlanta. And I have a problem with that. Now, as far as Clexa goes, I say to a lot of these people, and even people who are in the plains who talk about, showing two people kissing. I mean, two girls kissing, get over it. You've already seen it once. It isn't like we haven't seen this. I mean, they had the same conniption with the Rizzoli and Isles wedding a couple of years back. I mean, to me, it's like some people are gay and some people are lesbian and some people are bi and some people are trans. Get over it.
We have a caller right here, and this is a person who is rather opposed to you, Doc.
You dang tootin', I'm opposed to that. And Dr. Rochelle, I know you. And I know you're a church-going man. I know you are one.
And you would be right. Salem Freedom Baptist Church, 100%. But what's the problem here?
The problem is, talking all that Magnolia stuff ain't gonna free nobody in the Confederate States. And I don't think that you should be supporting sodomy and also turn around and talk about your pro-SCLC.
Now, whoa, just, no, you just cool your jets. Number one, apparently you have not heard of the Magnolia Army.
Magnolia Army? There shouldn't be no Magnolia Army. How is a bunch of sissies and sodomites going to fight for freedom?
Well, take it from somebody who works with the new Underground Railroad and somebody who's been in the Confederate States. Those so-called sissies and sodomites, they're down there fighting, putting their lives on the line, and dying the same way that black fists do, the same way that our troops have done. And yes, some of our troops are gay. And I wonder if you read the recent Plainswoman magazine. They had the profile about the fighter pilot who is getting the Flying Stalk, which is one of the highest honors of the Air Force for her actions over in Hungary.
Look, just spare
actions
me all that.
which
Spare
saved
me all
a lot
that.
of lives.
Of course, you're going to try and give me the spin of those people who are trying to sell something they know that's immoral and is wrong and is just wrong. And I think you, as a learned man, should know better.
I'm a learned man, and that's exactly why I know better, sir. And one thing I do know is I'm not going to tell a person who knocked 4 Confederate jets out of the sky that they cannot serve because it hurts your fragile sensibilities because they just happen to be transgender, or they happen to be lesbian, or they happen to be gay, or they happen to be bi, or whatever they're into.
So you're telling me you're okay with them putting all this sin sodomy on the TV like this dang Earth Tribe thing? What if it was your daughter watching it?
I'd be asking her, what do you think about Clark and Lex's dresses?
Well, Doc, we have maybe about 10 minutes left, so I want to take some of the stack of questions that we're getting from our Uninet audience that's listening in. And we've got this first one right here. We have a question here from one of our listeners who's in the Australia-New Zealand Commonwealth. This listener is asking, how are all of Maine's neighbors coping with the increased CSA military buildup?
That's a good question. Publicly, they're making a lot of condemnations and pronouncements. Privately, I would guess they're arming up and gearing up, and some not so privately. I know for a fact, for example, that right now New England has upped their posture. Quebec, even though Prime Minister Trudeau has called for restraint, they have been doing some things in their defense that shows that their postures change and become a bit more defense oriented and aggressive. Now, Ontario, Prime Minister Ackroyd has been out front and has called for. I mean, their most recent budget called for one of the largest defense increases in the history of Ontario, and they're talking about developing their own fifth gen. They're right now working on trials of their fifth generation jet fighter that they are now trying to get into production, the new Super Arrow. So there's a lot of eyes watching, especially with how the Confederates have not only befriended Maine, but have put a defined military presence, a military presence that I'm sure that New England doesn't want to see a full carrier group right in what's been New England's neighborhood for so long. So there's a lot of things, but you're seeing that across the world in many ways. But that again, it goes back to in that part of North America. For the first time, people are seeing what those of us who live west of the Mississippi have had to live with for quite some time.
Our next question comes from someone on Chirp, bookmark 1995. My main question is, why would Alaskans, rough and rugged people, be willing to risk civil war and become a Confederate sock puppet? That's quite a way to put it, wouldn't you say?
Well, only half of Alaska is that sock puppet bookmark. There's a whole northern half from Nome to the north to Point Barrow that's refused to be one. It's very perplexing why Alaska joined, why Todd Palin even got a hearing, but some of it had to do, unfortunately, with some people who let whiteness get in the way of democracy. And that's the best way I can put it. Because the indigenous tribes, the indigenous groups in Alaska hold a very important marker. They own a good deal of the energy resources. And there have been a lot of treaties between those who are indigenous and those who are of the white population. And deals are struck, but when certain political machinations of certain people got the ear of Lisa Murkowski, a lot of political things were done. There was a lot of things, and I can tell you, there's been a couple. There was a real good documentary that Carson Television out in California did on this issue that shows how you had the fissures in the Alaska Republican Party, in the main ruling party, that led to this. And then you had the situation in the election where the indigenous parties were thrown out, which in many ways was a bad decision. I talked to Chief Justice Alan Page of our Supreme Court here in the GPUR, and he said such a thing couldn't happen here. And he walked me through why that decision should have never been allowed by the high court, but it was. And that's what happens. You have a situation where sometimes people in the throes of trying to gain or keep political power make some poor decisions, and that's how you got what you got here. But ultimately, the people of Alaska decided to vote for the Juneau government. It was their right to do, but it wasn't the good pick, and they're finding that out.
We got another one here from the Australian New Zealand Commonwealth. This one identifies themselves on Chirp, Terra Nova 210486. They want to know, why hasn't anyone called for the impeachment of Paul Lepage, given what he's done in concert with the Confederate States?
Simply put, Terra Nova, the opposition doesn't have the votes. one thing that has been that the ruling government in Maine has been able to do is stifle a lot of the opposition. And one of the things they've done is in many ways, they have, when they won the election, they had the minority was razor thin. But then, due to a lot of different things, certain legislators got removed from office or they left the country. There have been a lot of differing stories on this, but it boils down to LaPage's party, the Maine First Coalition, has the majority of their legislative body. And in their system, that legislative body has to have a majority to proceed with an impeachment proceeding against the head of state. They don't have that. So that's why the legal channels are not going to see an impeachment. But what you are seeing instead is you're seeing open revolt on the streets in many ways in Maine right now. You're seeing a lot of protest, and I'm hearing it more and more from the people who have fled Maine, including, like I said earlier, a couple students who did. They're basically saying that, for all intents and purposes, Maine is in a state of civil war. Right now, that war is largely guerrilla and it's largely underground, but it's happening.
We have a question here from another person. This one coming from Friendsphere. Somebody calls themselves Son of Sphinx, and they identified that they're from the GPUR. They're from Wichita. Dr. Rochelle, there have been reports of continued movement of refugees coming to our country from the Confederate States. What type of numbers are we seeing across the board, and are there any specific instances that the public hasn't been made aware of, exemplified by the current situation?
Well, Spinks, to answer that question, we're always getting a decent number of refugees in the GPUR, along with all the other free North American nations. Under the Free North American Refugee Pact that was signed in 1985 and extended in 1990, there are certain quotas that every nation takes in, usually during emergency periods. And right now, we are in a defined emergency period. The National Unicameral last week passed an extension of our quota and an addition to the current number to help with the number of refugees that are coming in from Maine right now. We're getting some Maine refugees. We're getting refugees from Central America in concert with Texas and with the Southwestern Confederation, with Nevada, with California, with Utah. So we're not alone in this. That's one thing to understand. Now, as far as specific instances that the public hasn't made aware of, the public is pretty much fully aware. The government is not hiding it from you in any way, shape, or regard. Now, have there been some specific things? Yes, there has been, but that usually of a sensitive nature that involves national security, and that I can understand. But as far as what's going on in Maine, I mean, it's been on the news. It's been widely reported. Jonathan Edelstein for the GPBC recently came back from being embedded on the ground in Maine and did some excellent reporting. And if you get a chance, go to gpbc8.uni and check out some of the reporting. It's been really good. Also, Corinne, I want to mention a quick thing here. There's a group at Omaha University called Mavericks for Maine. It's a group that a group of students have put together to aid some of their dorm mates who fled Maine and are in school, and they're also trying to get back on their feet again. So we're taking up collections at this weekend's Omaha University Maverick football game. So when you see some of the kids with the Mavericks from Maine T-shirts on, and they're going to be bringing some buckets around, please fill the bucket, throw some change in, throw a couple dollars in. Let's swing up for kids who have come here seeking a brighter tomorrow, but also swinging up for those. But also we're taking collections to send humanitarian aid via extensions in the new Underground Railroad to Maine. And I think that's what free nations need to be doing. So this weekend, you come out to the Mavericks game, give what you can. You're going to be helping the cause of freedom and helping people get back on their feet.
Quickly, we only got maybe a couple minutes or so, but I do want to touch on one thing, because there's one thing I do know about you, Dr. Rochelle, is that you have three passions, or really four passions in your life. And you said your wife, Your Wife and Children, history, science fiction, and the Omaha Interstaters.
You would be right about that, and I know you want to talk about my staters a little bit. And
Well,
you
of
always wanna
course,
talk about my
we have to talk about the Staters. Weren't they great in Des Moines on Sunday?
Oh,
That
tell
was
me
incredible.
about it.
Where did this Ward kid come from?
Oh,
He's
yeah.
electrifying.
Oh, he is. Oh,
Finally, I think we got a quarterback.
I'm Teofilo Ward. I can tell you right now, after what you did Sunday, you won't have to buy lunch in this town for a little while. I thought we were in deep trouble when Alex got hurt, even though Alex wasn't playing great. And we were down by 13, but then Teofilo Ward got us out from under. It was incredible watching this kid. Now, Corinne, he came from University of Cienfuegos. He's a Cienfuegos Seminole. When we drafted this kid, I was thinking, I wasn't sure about it. I said,
I wasn't
"Is
sure
he
either."
ready to be our future? Well, I think the future's now because he really came off the bench, made some
Oh, yeah,
mistakes,
he
but
did.
also made some plays. That last touchdown to Wilson Thomas at the end of the game, that
Was
explosive.
lit. I didn't know Wilson Thomas was that fast. This guy can get downfield. I mean, he was open. Ward got the ball there, and do you think we can make the playoffs and maybe even make the Champions League?
Well, the key, obviously, keep winning. I mean, it'd be nice if Kansas City could drop a couple games and help get us back in the division, but most likely we're going to be one of the wild card teams getting into it, which means we got to play an extra game we have to play that game just to have the game to have a shot at least the third or the first place game. And perhaps we'll have to go the wild card route, the wild card weekend route to get in, or have to beat Wichita for the Grant Cup final to get in. But think of it like this. Remember the last time it seemed like it was impossible, and that was just a couple of years ago. Won a fifth place game because of the Super Bowl exemption. Then got into a wild card game, won that. Then got into the Champions League, did well. Then we needed a win in the final week. We're in the fourth quarter. We're down 25 points against the Austin Texans, come back and win and get to the Super Bowl. And if it wasn't for David Beckham with a 59-yard field goal at the gun, we win that. So I'll tell you this much. Corinne, I'll keep my fingers crossed, but I'll tell you, Teofilo Ward, welcome to Omaha.
I'll tell you, and that's about all the time we have, but we'd like you to come back. Think you can come back soon, perhaps after Carnes?
Oh, definitely. I'm going to want to come back and talk more about Carnes because that's going to be an interesting meeting. And I'll even bring the wife along because by the time I come back to this show, there will be 2 Dr. Rochelle.
I'm looking forward to that. Dr. Edie Rochelle, thank you for joining us on the Lunch Crunch today. And thanks to all our listeners joining us on the Lunch Crunch. The news and information continues right here on GPBC News Radio Omaha.